it's 10:32 here. I'll just check if we are live on YouTube and if people can see us live. Will take a minute. Okay, I think we are. Hi, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, from wherever you are joining us this evening, this morning, or this afternoon for you. My name is Ishan Sharma, and you are watching Carvan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. Carvan is an independent students collective in India, trying our best to make academic history popular in India and abroad on South Asia. And now we are expanding uh, our territory in some ways or our academic interest to global histories because we can't practice South Asian history in isolation. So to do that, we have a very special guest this evening with us, somebody who has been an inspiration for a whole range and whole generation of history and uh, sociology and anthropology students, somebody who has been in academia for over 50 years, if I'm not mistaken, or at least 45 to 50 years, and has been teaching and is one of the biggest contributors of the Frankfurt School of History, which we will talk about later on. I will just read out a small introduction about the lecture today and our speaker. About the title of the lecture is Can History Absolve? Can History Judge? Appealing to history rather than God to provide an ultimate judgment about human actions can have a justificatory or consolatory function. The former grants proleptic absolution for acts that may be morally dubious because of their benign consequences, while the latter allows victim in the present to gain a measure of relief by imagining they will be honored by posterity. In both cases, problematic assumptions about history and judgment call into action their faith that future generations will vindicate their struggles today. The first of these assumptions is that history conveys worth by what might be called victor's justice, in which success proves that the winner was morally superior. The second is that history is an impersonal process which can be recounted in a single meta narrative rather than an ongoing series of different narratives, which are themselves variable depending on who is doing the narration. When history means that the community of historians who recount and analyze the past, there is rarely, if ever, a grand consensus agreed upon by all. Finally, whereas the judgment of God is assumed to be qualitative and individual, perfect for each case, human judgment depends either on deontological rules, or which may be universal, or by analogies that are only roughly equivalent. In either case, the judgment can never transcend the fallibilities of those doing the judging and approach the perfection of a divine last judgment. Perhaps the most plausible version of history will judge is the realization that we are judged in the present by the still admirable aspirations of the past, which have yet to be realized. And to deliver this lecture, we have Professor Martin J. Martin J. Is one of the most influential and eminent intellectual historians of our times, a celebrated scholar of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Historiography. He is Sidney Herman Professor of History Emeritus at UC Berkeley and a member of the American Philosophical Society, with seminal works such as The Dialectical Imagination, Downcast Eyes, Reflections of Violence, and most recently, Immanent Critiques, The Frankfurt School Under Pressure, which came in 2023. Professor J has shaped generations of thought across disciplines, and his ongoing research delves into the intersection of nominalism and photography, while his writing continues to appear in renowned journals and books. So, without further ado, I welcome Professor J. Thank you so much, Martin, for accepting this invitation. It is such an honor to host you this evening.
Thank you, Ishan. The honor is really mine. The privilege is mine to speak to an Indian audience from so many miles away. I've enjoyed being in India in the past. In person, it's great to speak to a new generation today. I'm afraid that I have an actual lecture here. I mean, I'm going to be delivering a real lecture, so I'm going to have to read it. It will come out, for those of you interested, in the journal History and Theory in about 6 months. So I hope I won't speak too fast. I know I have an American accent, but those of you who are interested, it'll appear there. So without further ado, let me begin. On October 16th, 1953, a young Cuban lawyer, himself on trial, was allowed to deliver a 2-hour-long speech in his own defense. The charge against him was that he had led a lethal attack on the Moncada military barricades in Santiago de Cuba the previous July. Aimed at securing arms for an incipient revolution, the assault had killed 15 soldiers, 3 policemen, along with 10 rebels. Now, although in the short run a failure, it was ultimately hailed as the initial act in the successful revolution that brought the young lawyer and his comrades to power a half-decade later. Smuggled out in matchbooks, the speech itself soon became the manifesto of what was called the 26th of July movement. The speech was titled, "Condemn me, it doesn't matter, history will absolve me. Condemn me, it doesn't matter, history will absolve me." Perhaps as nothing else in the endless flood of words that was spoken by Fidel Castro in his long career, the phrase, "history will absolve me," history will absolve me has survived as a pithy expression of every revolutionary's self-justifying credo. That Castro reframed it in religious terms, absolution, after all, is what a priest does to forgive sins, shows, I think, its ultimate pedigree. The idea that God will render a verdict on our actions at the last judgment, dividing sinners from the saved, have been secularized in the 18th century into the belief that something called history could perform the same function. At least since the great poet Friedrich Schiller's Resignation, a poem of 1785, the phrase Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht, world history is the world court. Ever since then, that phrase has been in circulation, helped along by Hegel's evocation of it in The Philosophy of Right in 1821. By 1840, it was already well enough known to be mocked by the poet Hoffmann von Fallibilities, famous, in fact, for writing the lyrics of the German national anthem, Deutschland über alles. It was mocked as a dish that had to be arduously cooked to make it palatable to most stomachs. But faith in the absolving power of history, as we can see in the case of Fidel Castro, has remained potent as a resource for those who seek to justify transgressive, perhaps even morally questionable actions in the present. Or more precisely, it has remained a rhetorical ploy that can serve a variety of functions in different contexts, despite the dubious premises that I hope to show on which it is based. That it continues to be a temptation is demonstrated by the recent appearance of Joan Wallach Scott's little book, On the Judgment of History, which still finds it necessary to challenge its problematic implications. Joan Scott focuses most of her attention on 3 cases in that book: the Nuremberg trials after World War II, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the movement for reparations for slavery in the United States. The latter 2 in particular involve what has come to be called the restorative justice movement, which seeks not only to judge the past, but to repair the ongoing damages left in its wake. Here, the legal system is employed to provide restitution for victims and hold the victimizers accountable, at least their descendants. Redress for past injuries, ranging from war crimes and the colonization of indigenous peoples' lands to the theft of works of art, has stirred a lively international debate about what can be held, who rather can be held responsible, and to whom reparations can be made for the actions of our ancestors. Now, although what Scott has to say about each of her cases is valuable, she only addresses the larger theoretical issues raised by claiming history can judge quickly and in passing. So in this lecture, what I want to do is to explore them in greater depth, and then conclude with a brief suggestion for a valid version, potentially valid version, for the idea of historical judgment. Now, what first has to be addressed is the extent to which the judgment of history is a straightforward secularization of the religious idea of the last judgment. Basically, Judeo-Christian idea. Be very interested to hear if in traditions in India and Hindu or Muslim traditions there's anything comparable. In any event, does it have the capacity to deliver what, at least in one religious tradition, is called absolution? Unqualified claims of the straightforward transfer of content from religious to secular frameworks, these claims have in fact not gone unchallenged. A salient example being Hans Blumenberg's trenchant critique of Karl Löwit and Carl Schmitt's version of political theology in Blumenberg's book, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age. We should hesitate, in other words, before automatically assuming that something called history can serve as a simple replacement, as if there was a one-for-one connection for God as a judge at the end of time. Looked at closely, the metaphor of absolution invoked by Castro in the written version of a celebrated courtroom defense immediately shows some of the problems. According to the Catholic tradition into which he was born, it can be granted only in response to an act of contrition, in which sins are forthrightly confessed, forgiveness is implored, and penance is assigned and accepted. The penitent must make a sincere sacramental confession of guilt. He must express both sorrow and the resolve not to repeat the sin. Now, there is, needless to say, nothing in Castro's defiant courtroom speech that smacks of a contrite confession of sins or a promise not to commit them again. And his penance, the 15-year term that was commuted after less than 2 years in prison, was imposed by the legal system, which never granted him in return the absolution he awaited from history. In short, if one can speak of a parallel between divine last judgment and the judgment of history, it certainly did not follow the specific path of a sacramental absolution in the Catholic tradition. Well, what can we say about the more general parallel between divine and historical judgment? Sometimes it has merely been understood as posterity perpetually recalling with gratitude the great deeds done and unselfish sacrifices endured on its behalf. Robespierre, for example, Robespierre addressed future generations in a speech he gave to the Jacobin Club in 1792. He writes, "O posterity, sweet and tender hope of humanity, thou art not a stranger to us. It is for thee that we brave all the blows of tyranny. It is thy happiness which is the price of our painful struggles," end quote. Here, Robespierre was merely giving a political twist to Diderot's earlier claim that, quote, posterity is for the philosopher what the other world, heaven, is for the religious. Now, the parallel between earthly posterity and a religious afterlife is also inexact, but being preserved in perpetual collective memory is what is best called fame. As Hannah Arendt points out, it had been, in fact, a pagan virtue in ancient Greece, where a prime motivation of political action in the public sphere was desire for the ongoing admiration of posterity. She writes, men's life together in the form of the polis seemed to assure that the most futile of human activities, action, and speech, and the least tangible and most ephemeral of man-made products, the deeds and stories which are their outcome, would become imperishable, end quote. Not restricted to noble achievements or self-sacrifice in the service of a larger cause, however, fame can also be attained by less laudable means. In fact, as shown by the notorious example of Herostratus, the 4th century BCE arsonist who destroyed the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, the imperishable memory of posterity could recall horrible as well as great deeds. The line, we might say, between infamy and fame turns out to be very thin indeed. Now, the parallel between the religious last judgment and the alleged judgment of history has, in fact, a much more ambitious telos than mere fame. Its goal is the achievement of an ultimate justice, a justice that may be denied during a finite human lifetime. To be saved for all eternity is, after all, not the same as becoming famous or even worse, notorious in the memories of future generations. There are, however, other troubles with the analogy from divine to historical judgment. They begin, I would argue, with the first term of the putative parallel, the eschatological faith that human lives can be judged in their entirety by a discerning God, able to evaluate each of them individually as worthy of redemption at the end of time. Although for some a powerful response to the troubling reality that bad things often happen to good people in this life, it provides little comfort for others who are unable to endure the suspense of waiting until time ends to know their fate and compensate for their suffering. Theological disputes, in fact, have reflected this very uncertainty and impatience from the very beginning. Theologians have wondered, for example, when the commission of specific sins will transform the actor into a damnable sinner, as if the actions determine his or her character. When the commission of specific sins will transform acts into that of a character whose life can then be judged as a coherent whole. They have asked if the commission of such sins can be canceled by the repentance of the sinner, even at the hour of death, and then wiped from the record to reverse that damnable characterization. Can faith alone, they wonder, cancel out the effects of deeds, whatever their moral value? Are good intentions sufficient to cancel out evil results? Are humans really free in the first place to act for good or for ill, or are they predetermined by an ineffable providence that relieves them of responsibility for the results? Should we observe moral commands because they function to secure our salvation, a motivation that shades into selfishness, or because we're obliged by duty to obey them for their own sakes, as, for example, Kant would say? Well, the list can easily be expanded, but the point is that virtually all of these unresolved theological questions will demand to be addressed when something called history replaces God as the ultimate arbiter. The problem is then further compounded if we put a little pressure on the notion of history itself. We should recall that in most Western languages, the word history covers both the events, occurrences, or actions that happened in the past, what in Latin is called res gestae, and the representation, narrative, or explanatory reconstruction of those happenings, the historia rerum gestorum, something that is recorded after the passage of time. Lord, let's take these two meanings in order. According to Reinhard Koselleck, there have been 5 distinct evaluations of the relationship between justice and res gestae, history as it actually happened. The first he identifies with the Greek historian Herodotus, who argued that because humans create their own destinies, they are responsible for the fate that befalls them, or more precisely, that the gods reward or punish them during their lives for what they have done. Here we might say justice is imminent in historical real time, as experienced, not as recollected. The second position is that of Thucydides, Thucydides who recognized that humans are sometimes caught up in forces they do not control. There may well be an irreconcilable conflict between power and law, or even between two moral systems which cannot be easily adjudicated. There is thus, Thucydides argues, an impersonal chain of cause and effect in history which may not map onto human action and responsibility or allow atonement for guilt. A third model, Koselleck tells us, enters the picture with Augustine, the Christian St. Augustine, who acknowledged the interaction of both the Herodotean and Thucydidean models when it came to mundane history, but argued that there was true justice at the end of time reserved for God and kept secret from men until that last moment. Here, the religious idea of the last judgment was introduced to delay the reckoning and asked men to be patient on the basis of faith in divine goodness. There were 2 final models, Koselleck tells us, 2 that emerged during the Western Enlightenment. The first he calls the absurdist model. Absurdist because it realizes that without that Augustinian faith in an ultimate reckoning, history becomes a meaningless, random story, a story of unintended consequences, of unrewarded good actions, and unpunished transgressions. The absurdist position regained its potency in the contemporary world, Koselleck observes, in response to the indigestible and inexplicable horror of the Holocaust, which resists any effort to justify it as an unintended means to a positive outcome, not even the creation of the State of Israel. The fifth position is the one we've already encountered, in which the ultimate court will be history itself. Koselleck notes the stakes are higher than the salvation of the singular souls. Quote, for the justice in history becomes the mover not just of individual histories, but also of world history as a whole, mercilessly and without any compensation, as in the Last Judgment. Now, in addition to the a priori attribution of what can be called sufficient reason in a Leibnizian theodicy to apparently impersonal causes and effects, which imbued mechanical causation with theological meaning, that every cause really has a reason behind it, this final model is dependent on two other assumptions that are no less, I would say, problematic. The first concerns the concept of Weltgeschichte, world history itself, which is made possible by the coordination of the different calendars of all known cultures into a single chronology, a task first attempted by an 11th century scholar from what is now Uzbekistan, Abu Rayyan Muhammad al-Biruni. The stage was set by Biruni, but going beyond mere chronological integration, the fully formed idea of world history, Weltgeschichte, only really arrived in the 18th century with the claim that abstract, quantitatively measurable time could also be fashioned into a single, qualitatively distinct narrative, a narrative that was shaped with a coherent plot and imbued with meaning and with a protagonist. Reflecting the expanding European colonization of the globe, and intensified international trade, spurred on by the Enlightenment ambition to unify knowledge and share the benefits of a scientific worldview, it led to a new confidence in the imminent development of a universal history, led, of course, by a small group of nations on the western tip of the Eurasian landmass. Although attempts to discern universality in an allegedly constant human nature did not end, and people talked about ahistorical human nature, new attention was paid to the historical development of the species over time. Sometimes it's called an historiosophical notion of our development, which seemed to be an accelerating process of teleological integration. While the distinction between, quote, advanced and, quote, backward local histories was acknowledged, they also could be folded into a single collective story of what Marxists, later Marxists like Leon Trotsky, were to call combined and uneven development. Now, with the emergence of the idea of world history, the balance between history, the word history understood as res gestae, as what happened, and history understood as historia rerum gestorum, what we record or narrate about what happened, shifted in favor of the former. As Koselleck has noted, almost stealthily, a historiography which had been making judgments since antiquity turned into a history, the German history, which autonomously executed its judgments, autonomously, history without historians. Despite the special role of what Hegel liked to call world historical figures, those judgments were to be passed more on large-scale movements or even impersonal tendencies like the rise of capitalism or overseas colonization than on individual lives. When the French Revolution exploded on a Europe that was stunned by its contagious effect, it seemed to signal a new epoch in world history, a new epoch in the history of the species as a whole. Hannah Arendt, in fact, once claimed that, quote, the very notion of world history was born from the first attempt at world politics. Whatever its cause, the intensified faith in the inexorable power of world history was informed by an often unacknowledged theoretical transformation, which Koselleck has described as singularization and simplification, in which, for example, freedom with a capital F took the place of freedoms, justice, that of rights and servitudes, progress with a capital P, that of progressions, and from the diversity of revolutions, that of the revolution. Whether defined in terms of modernization theory, succession of modes of production, increased secularization, or social and political emancipation, coherent, normatively infused meta-narrative embracing the species as a whole, humankind as a whole, gained increasing credence, especially among those cultures that prided themselves as being in advance or having a mission to civilize the rest of the world. Whether based on the fiction of a meta-subject or world spirit responsible for, quote, making history, or on impersonal processes that work, as Marx said, someplace behind the backs and against the wills of individuals, the outcome was the totalization of discrete histories into a single story. Even when the 20th century revolutions happened in so-called backward countries like Russia, China, or Cuba, it was possible to justify them in terms of a world history whose cunning allowed normative stages of development to be leaped over, and the apparent last to become the actual first. Trotsky's uneven and combined development meant that sometimes apparent backwardness could be turned into an advantage in the larger narrative of progress. A case in point is Georg Lukács's defense in his History and Class Consciousness in 1923, his defense of the Bolshevik Revolution happening in Russia, backward Russia, rather than the more advanced capitalist countries where Marx had expected it to occur. Perhaps even more significantly, Lukács defended the idea of a projected course of world history as the way to overcome not only class divisions, but also what he called the antinomies of bourgeois thought. The antinomies of bourgeois thought, such as the tension between unethical means and ethical ends, the overcoming of them through the ultimate reconciliation of morality and power in a future communist society. The same reasoning would allow Nikolai Bukharin and his colleagues on trial for betraying the revolution a decade later to cite Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht, world history is the world court, in accepting and even, this is extraordinary, even justifying their own defeat at the hands of Stalin, who represented world history. Now, although it's been claimed, for example, by Joan Scott, that faith in the judgment of history is inevitably based on the nation state as the culmination of the linear progress that leads to a redeemed future, I think the examples of Castro, Lukács, and Bukharin show that other normative ends, such as global communism, might serve the same function. The crucial point is that some variant of this worldly redemption functioned as the implied future standpoint, the firm ground from which historical judgment can be retrospectively exercised. Now, whatever the implied telos, the state, the nation state, the communist utopia, whatever the telos, confidence in the justified sacrifice of the individual in the name of historical necessity has not, I want to argue, flourished with the passage of time in the projected course of Weltgeschichte. The return of what Koselleck called the absurdist model, in which the Holocaust served as the chief impediment to a simple-minded attempt to find a theodicy in history, has been reinforced by the post-colonial assault on Eurocentrism and the crises of theories of modernization, secularization, and successive modes of production. The collapse of the Soviet Union put an exclamation point on the vanity, the foolishness of Lukács's belief that 1917 had opened a new chapter in the collective story of species-wide emancipation, not only from economic exploitation and injustice, but also from technological reification and the spiritual malaise of what he called transcendental homelessness. Even before the ignominious end of the Soviet experiment, chastened Marxists like Theodor Adorno could conclude in the critique of the concept of progress that the idea of universal history, he writes, cannot be salvaged. That idea was plausible only as long as we could believe in the illusion of an already existing humanity, coherent in itself and moving upwards in a unified manner, end quote. By our own day, globalization, understood as the spread of the neoliberal market, came to be scorned on both the right and the left. postmodernism, if it meant anything at all, signaled what Jean-Francois Lyotard famously called incredulity towards meta-narratives. Now, although we may now be in a postmodern era called the Anthropocene, in which climate change threatens us with a new species-wide story, albeit of collective decline rather than progress, it's highly unlikely that the result will be Weltgeschichte that's really a Weltgericht, where it's by no means clear that it will ever bring anything resembling justice to those people who will suffer most from the results of global warming, despite their having contributed the least to its causes. Now, this disturbing outcome points to the second reason that belief in the capacity of history, understood as res gesta, the things that really happened, to judge, the second reason it's been undermined. Those with reservations about the substitution of a deontological notion of morality for a consequentialist one, what we might call a Kantian rather than a Hegelian view of the relation between right and might, or law and power, have always resisted the danger of equating success in historical terms with inherent virtue, consequences somehow trumping what we might call universal moral norms. Why, such critics wonder, why is a life thwarted in the present any less worthy of happiness or longevity or flourishing than the future life that might possibly be in a way enhanced as a result of that thwarting? Why equate victor's justice, in which winners are rewarded by winning and losers are punished for losing, with the real thing? Why should the facts on the ground produced by successful conquest be granted retrospective normative validation? Now, the uncritical conflation of facts and values has in fact often generated dissent against Schiller's maxim, die Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht. Take the case of Hannah Arendt, for example, described by Sheila Ben Habib. She writes, the very structure of traditional historical narration, couched as it is in chronological sequence and the logic of precedence and succession, serves to preserve what has happened by making it seem inevitable, necessary, plausible, understandable, and in short, justifiable. Nothing seemed more abhorrent to Hannah Arendt, Sheila Ben Habib tells us, than the dictum that die Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht. Her response to this was the same as Walter Benjamin's: to break the chain of narrative continuity, to shatter chronology as the natural structure of narrative, to stress fragmentariness, historical dead ends, failures, and rupture, end quote. The alternative to the hegemonic notion of the judgment of history, which confuses might with right, offered by Arendt and Benjamin, should not, however, be understood simply as an endorsement of what Koselleck has called the absurdist view of the meaninglessness of history. For it too expresses the belief that at least some justice can be done retrospectively to at least honor the memories of hitherto forgotten victims or marginalized peoples. That is, it offers what might be called a consolatory rather than a vindicatory version of the idea that history can judge, a version that consoles rather than vindicates. While it refuses to conflate apparent worldly success with virtue, or absolve those who employ dubious means what they hope will be laudable ends, Castro, for example, it does seek to provide some measure of solace, of consolation for the losers, that history will at least not forget them entirely. Its danger, however, as Joan Scott observes, that it can act, quote, as a fantasy, seemingly deferring action to a force, history, outside our control. Now, at times, to be sure, the goal of revising the hegemonic narrative from the point of view of the losers may be to repair the damage done in the past to innocent victims by compensating their descendants for their losses, modeled on the remedies that are provided by tort law. This is a path taken by restorative justice movements, which involve moral absolutes, invoke moral absolutes to counter the tainted judgment of, quote, successful historical outcomes. But even if such a reparative balance can be calculated and lessons applied, compensation for past ills, I would argue, can never justify the initial damage in terms of a theodicy that makes partial evil a means to a greater good. The future beneficiaries of the violent acts of revolutionaries who act on their behalf have no right to expect sacrifices from their predecessors who may have had no choice in the matter. Likewise, the experience of past suffering cannot be mitigated no matter how beneficial the outcome may be for those who come after. We may align ourselves with Benjamin Arendt in trying to rescue the victims of triumphalist hegemonic narratives from oblivion, but I think we have to acknowledge that their quest for restitutive justice also has its limits. Redemption, in which what has been broken is made whole, or what is taken has been returned, may be a widely shared religious aspiration, but it's not one that can ever be realized in mundane history. Those injuries, I'm saying, to those in the past have been done, they can't be made up. It's none less important to register that the consolatory version of the idea that history will judge, voiced by Arendt, Benjamin, and others, has subtly shifted the logic of the argument. It moves away from what Koselleck identified as the 18th century definition of the term history, primarily with res gestae, with what really happened, and moves it back towards historia rerum gestorum, the post facto recounting of what really happened by us, by historians. That is, it assigns the task of judging to the narratives constructed by those who write history rather than locating it as immanent in the ongoing impersonal process of history itself. As Arendt puts it in her polemic against the Hegelian equation of justice to alleged success in the course of actual history, and I quote her, "If judgment is our faculty for dealing with the past, the historian is the inquiring man who, by relating it, sits in judgment over it. If that is so, we may reclaim our human dignity, with it back, as it were, from the pseudo divinity named history of the modern age. Win it back from that pseudo divinity without denying history's importance, but denying its right to be the ultimate judge." What Arendt is suggesting, in other words, is that judgment is not so much a prerogative of an impersonal process with its alleged winners and losers, but rather of those who will write it in the future. Now, although a welcome corrective to the dubious Hegelian assumption that justice is immanent in the historical expression of rational Geist, the relocation of history to mean the narrative of future historians is also based on several vulnerable assumptions. The first involves the tacit identification of relating the past, narrating or explaining it, with judging it in an impartial manner, sine ire et studio, with anger and passion, as the Roman historian Tacitus famously put it. This normally suggests that enough time must pass, time that will leave partisanship aside, time that will gain a disinterested view above the fray. If there's any distinction between the wise judgment of posterity and the short-sighted judgment of the victor, it must be based on the cooling off period provided by the passage of time. I think when Joan Scott, in fact, invokes the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War as an example of the judgment of history, she is wrongly telescoping the process of distancing that allows passions to cool and interests to wane. But be that as it may, there is still uncertainty about what kind of judgment that even a distant posterity might dispassionately exercise for less extreme cases. In other words, having put some pressure on the idea of history, we now have to put a little pressure on the idea of judgment itself. The last judgment, theology tells us, will be qualitatively exercised for each unique case because of God's infinite power of individuating discrimination. God is able, in other words, to exercise his judgment for each individual case, unbound by a priori principles or dependent on rigid criteria. He can exercise his ineffable mercy even when sinners transgress against the abstract laws he has commanded. God has that incredible privilege. The humans who write history, on the other hand, have to judge without God's ineffable intuitions and are dependent either on general rules under which they subsume cases or on comparisons between paradigmatic examples. Kant's famous distinction in his third critique between determinative and what he called reflective judgments, the first drawing on the subsumption of particular cases under principles, general rules, the second, what he called reflective judgments, on analogies between or among cases, pretty much, I think, exhausts the possibilities for fallible human historians like us, those who recount the past and in so doing judge it. The first, Kant tells us, may best describe the epistemological premises of science, and the second, the ground of aesthetic judgment, although as Arendt demonstrates, the latter might also be at work in the realm of politics as well. It's less obvious, however, how they would map on to the moral or normative evaluations that would have to be made when we talk of the judgment of historians. For each mode of judging comes with certain limitations when it involves even the most disinterested posterity assessing the past. In the case of determinate judgments, those generalized, supposedly universal laws, even the most disinterested posterity assessing the past is uncertain if the general standards or rules under which specific cases must be subsumed can in fact ever be accepted as binding for all times and places. That is, however much we may yearn for a deontological set of general principles that can be applied with absolute certainty, there's always a threat of false universalization, extrapolated from particular values. It was, in fact, precisely to avoid this very danger that believers in world history, as the locus of judgment, like Lukács, Bukharin, or Castro, scorned the universalizing claims of contemporary bourgeois morality to judge their actions in the present, and bet instead on the future development of the species, or at least the greater wisdom of posterity. But I would argue there is no reason to assume that future generations will have an easier access to a legitimate universal standard of judgment by which to redeem or condemn their more benighted predecessors than we do. Here, too, the voice of something called world history may turn out to be that of a ventriloquist, claiming to represent the species as a whole, but still situated in one of its discrete parts. Anachronistically imposing contemporary values on a past that held different ones, and assuming that ours are universally valid, may not produce, in other words, wise and balanced judgment, but instead what the great British historian E.P. Thompson famously denounced as the enormous condescension of posterity. If there is, I would argue, no all-seeing view from nowhere, to cite Thomas Nagel's famous phrase, there is also no ultimate view from no when, in which historical change ceases to flow into an uncertain future. The alternative reflective judgment may seem more promising, especially if we accept Arendt's attempt to demonstrate its importance for politics as well as aesthetics. Based on the old Aristotelian idea of phronesis, or practical wisdom, in which the inevitable entanglement of ends and means can guide prudential action, it draws on a kind of learning process over time, based on the putative lessons of experience. As such, it would seem an appropriate model for the approach later historians might follow to judge the past. The difficulty, however, is that it reduces that judgment to the analogical comparison of what might not be fully commensurable examples. Although Kant claimed it operates with the as-if teleological assumption that a universal can be found that will justify such comparisons, it acknowledges the impossibility of locating it in a binding general concept or abstract rule. The best that reflective judgment really can hope for is the practical agreement of a future sensus communis that achieves a tentative consensus about, say, what is beautiful, what is not. Now, the regulative ideal of such a consensus among the community of historians may be the best criterion we have of judging the truth value, or at least plausibly trying to say different narratives, one is better than the other. But there are two difficulties with applying the standard of analogical reflective judgment to history. First, although comparison does have an obvious role in our attempt to interpret and even explain the past, allowing us, for instance, to reconstruct what Crane Brinton famously called an anatomy of typical revolutions, it's not clear that we can judge in any normative way exemplars of revolution that fail to live up to an essential model. In fact, measuring every revolution against the archetypical 18th century one that happened in France risks violating the ideographic impulse in the writing of history, that is to say, the impulse which honors the irreducible uniqueness of every historical episode or event. And when something happens that seems to defy comparison, the most obvious case, some people argue, being the Holocaust, we may be doing it an injustice by engaging in the analogical reasoning of reflective judgment, which diminishes its uniqueness. There is, I think, an even more problematic assumption behind the hope that posterity can never really reach a single sensus communis about the past, rather than merely treating it as a regulative ideal. Orential recall speaks of the historian as, quote, the inquiring man who by relating history sits in judgment over it, end quote, rather than the impersonal success of the historical process itself. But as a rather blithely unreflective identification of the historian with a man suggests, she too hastily reduces the different future historians of whatever gender with and with whatever perspective with a single narrator, a narrator who stands somehow for all, a male narrator. Although distance in time may weaken the powerful grip of immediate passions and interests, it does not release it entirely. And as Hayden White has taught us, no matter how much agreement may be reached about the facts on which narratives are based, looking at the documents, looking at the evidence, the way they are stylistically imploded will depend on implicit rhetorical tropes that remain incommensurable. Often, in other words, what is narrated as a tragedy from one point of view will from another be seen as having produced a comic outcome in the sense of a positive resolution of conflict. The difference may well on the identification the future historian may have with different protagonists in the original story. When we write a story, we often identify with someone as the good guy and someone else as the villain. Now, just to be anecdotal for a second, I remember very well when I first became aware of this difference, which occurred during a visit to the Museo Nacional de Historia in Mexico City back in the 1970s. I encountered there for the first time an unfamiliar retelling of what I had been taught in school in America as the Mexican-American War of 1846-48. In Mexico, I discovered it's called instead the American intervention in Mexico, and the outcome treated as a national disaster rather than the vindication of the United States' manifest destiny to reach the Pacific Ocean. A similar dissensus can occur in the historiography within a country over time, as vividly illustrated by successive narratives of the American Civil War. After what might be called the period of the North's victor justice, which lasted until the end of the Reconstruction period in the mid-1870s, a deliberate campaign to redeem what was called, it's interesting the word redemption, what was called the lost cause of the South was launched by unapologetic white supremacists. Justifying the new era of Jim Crow laws, undermining the gains made by free blacks during Reconstruction, the Civil War was renamed the War Between the States. And the issue of ending or preserving slavery was minimized. It was marginalized as a cause of the conflict. Monuments to Confederate heroes were erected all over the South. Army bases everywhere were named after them. And movies like D.W. Griffith's classic Birth of a Nation, 1915, reinforced a new judgment of history, which was quintessentially expressed by the influential historian Ulrich B. Phillips in his American Negro Slavery of 1918, which made slavery a benign, if not always profitable institution, beneficial to both owners and their human property, and justified, so Ulrich argued, by the racial inferiority of the latter. Now, although isolated voices like W.E.B. Du Bois challenged Phillips' prevailing perspective, it was not until Kenneth Stamps, the peculiar institution, in 1955, that the community of historians, professional historians, began to abandon the apologetic account of slavery. And it took another 2 generations and atrocities like the police murder of George Floyd in 2020, the revised judgment of historians to permeate the national consciousness enough to topple those statues erected and rename military bases during the Jim Crow era to honor the lost cause and to keep blacks in their place. And now, ironically, we're seeing in the Trump administration once again an attempt to reverse precisely this. The battle for the history of the United States is still being fought. In short, the challenge of reconciling contesting viewpoints is exacerbated if we acknowledge the implication of moving from a divine last judgment at the end of time to the judgment of posterity, more precisely the community of historians who voice it. Although God may judge from the perspective of eternity, historians remain within an ongoing process, a process that is infinitely unfolding, at least until there will be no humans left to judge anything. There is, in other words, no last historian who will finally get the story right. Minerva's owl may fly at dusk, but Pace Hegel historians are always operating in the glare of the midday sun, even when they conveniently divide the past into discrete epochs whose time seems to have come and gone. There is no perspective wide enough to incorporate all the partial perspectives of previous accounts, no inclusive community of historians that will reach a unanimous consensus about the past, nor is it always possible to see everything more clearly from a greater distance than from a closer one, especially when we might say the uneven surface with its hidden recesses of the past is flattened out into a smooth plane. To make matters even more complicated, the moment of retrospective clarity in which judgment sine ire et studio seems finally at hand is itself always the incipient past of a yet to be realized future whose narrative shape is impossible to predict with any certainty. As in the case of the Jim Crow era consensus about the American Civil War, which is now so much on the defensive, it's always premature to think that you have reached final judgments. The famous remark attributed to the communist leader Zhou Enlai in 1972, when asked about the effects of the French Revolution, when he said, "It is too early to say," should become a motto for anyone who thinks history can judge. All right, in conclusion, after identifying all of these problems, can we finally see anything of value that's really left of the idea that something called history can actually judge, can legitimately serve as a secular substitute for belief in a divine last judgment? Well, it seems to me there are two possible answers, two possible candidates, albeit without either being the vindicatory or consolatory, serving the function that is sought to serve in the past. The first is what might be called its as-if function, as a stimulus to action in the present. Kant, whose anticipatory resistance to the Hegelian idea of mere success as a moral criterion we've already encountered, Kant offered a very different approach in his great essay of 1784, The Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Aim, sometimes translated cosmopolitan intent. Here he entertained a thought experiment based on a theoretical idea of reason, the idea for universal history, which was speculative and a priori rather than grounded in certain knowledge of an immanent and automatic historical logic. That unverifiable idea, regulative idea, posits a hidden path of nature to bring about an ultimate state, a cosmopolitan harmony, through the antagonisms, including even war, that appear as what Kant labeled unsocial sociability. The means, in other words, may be indefensible in terms of an absolutist deontological morality, war, for example, but maybe they can be justified as necessary for redemption in the historical future. Now, there are many problematic assumptions underlying Kant's account of how that plan might be realized, including his belief that history understood as a universal narrative will have its protagonists in the advanced nations of Europe. But what it does frankly acknowledge is its ability to function as a spur to possible realization, in other words, to action, rather than pretending to express a preordained plan destined to be carved out by what Hegel would have called the cunning of history. Joan Scott identifies this function as, quote, assessing actions, our own and those of others, from the perspective of an imagined redemptive future that we will have had a hand in creating. That is, rather than providing compensatory comfort for current injustice, it might inspire action to challenge them. The problem, of course, remains the unlikelihood that our version of redeemed future will coincide with that of everyone else's, and therefore the actions we take may not produce an ultimate reconciliation of perspectives. Faith in the alleged judgment of history can, moreover, inspire a whole range of actions whose effects may not live up to their intentions, which may well lead later historians to recall proverbial wisdom about which actions pave the roads to hell. Good intentions. As a result, it may be wiser to adopt a more modest approach. And I want to conclude with this thought by rethinking a crucial premise of the whole enterprise, one which will allow us to relocate history, the history that will judge. That is, we can return to the word's basic meaning as either what already happened or what we in the present recount of that past, rather than extrapolate the word to mean an unknown future that will one day become the past. History will judge. We normally write about the former in the preterite tense, something called the simple past, to describe an action that's fully completed. History tells us what has already happened. The latter is written in the future perfect tense, suggesting the time of what will come to be a completed future in what will be that future. Will come to be a rather completed past and will be that future. If we restrict history, the history that will judge, to what happened actually in the past, or how it's been recounted in the past and the present, the preterite tense, there are several advantages over the use of the future perfect to guess about a future that's not yet happened. First, we avoid what E.P. Thompson damns as the enormous condescension of posterity, because we do not arrogantly assume that what comes later is always better, or that we are in every respect more enlightened, more civilized than our ancestors were. This is not to argue for a simple reversal of the ideology of progress or the adoption of an equally one-directional narrative of decline, in which we mourn some lost golden age, see ourselves decadent and corrupt. It's instead a reminder that we should study the past not only for shortcomings, which we might overcome, or mistakes that we might avoid, but also for normatively positive examples, institutions, practices, acts, and ideas that may still inspire us. As Theodor Adorno once argued in criticizing attempts to judge what was, quote, living and dead in Hegel according to our current standards, such standards are based, quote, on the impudent claim that because one has the dubious good fortune to live later, and because one has a professional interest in the person one is to talk about, one can sovereignly assign the dead person his place, thereby in some sense elevating oneself above them. This arrogance, Adorno goes on, echoes in the loathsome question, one in Kant and now in Hegel as well, has any meaning for the present. In other words, it would be far wiser, Adorno contends, to judge the present according to the standards set in the philosophy of a figure like Hegel, or maybe Kant, whose insights into the nature of freedom and hopes for the realization of reason in history might still have something to teach us. The same might be said of social and political movements in the past, movements whose laudable aspirations might still be worth pitting against our failure to realize them. There is, to be sure, a certain ventriloquism in projecting the active judgment on figures, ideas, or movements in the past who cannot in any way, any literal sense, evaluate what we have made of their works, their hopes, their dreams. Nor can we legitimately mobilize the religious rhetoric of absolution to vindicate our actions in the present by measuring them against such a standard. But unlike the fantasy, the future generations will have the wisdom and achieve the unity to pass judgment on us. It at least allows us to learn some lessons from a past that really did exist. It avoids, in other words, the acrobatics that projects history onto the future, while also fostering some humility in judging those who came before us. And in so doing, it prevents us from outsourcing our moral responsibilities to our imagined descendants. In short, it avoids the fallacy of substituting posterity for divinity and making a definitive or final judgment that in fact can never come. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor J, for that brilliant lecture. And it has raised a lot of questions, including if, for example, the secular history, so to say, if we can call it that, the secular historical judgment lacks in the omniscience and moral certainty of divine judgment that you were talking about. What standards, if any, should historians use to evaluate past actions or especially past figures? Because historical figures are the most interesting ones to study. So how do you react to that?
Well, I think the reality is that we all are imbued with values, with norms. We all have our own investment in the world. That we don't have the distance, the absolute disinterested quality that would allow us to be completely neutral in describing the past. Now, having said that, there is still a, we might say, professional pressure to realize what our values are and try to bracket them, try to, in a sense, say, yes, I know I am a believer in this position as progressive, this position is regressive. I see this man as a hero, this man as a villain, this woman as a model, this one as worthy of being emulated and so forth. We have those values, but we also have a kind of meta level, we might say professional pressure to try to ask hard questions about what might be seen as the contextual limitations of the moment when something was done, and not simply write history, which is history that is advocacy history based on an a priori recognition that everything leads up to where we are today or we hope to go in the future. So in other words, do a kind of, I would say, reflective understanding that we can't be neutral, we can't be dispassionate, we're not machines. When I read the story of an atrocity in the past, I feel some delayed empathy, we might say, for innocent victims. I can't avoid, because of my moral intuitions, I can't avoid feeling that. And yet I have to somehow ask different kinds of questions. So there is, I think, in every, and that's what makes history in some ways exciting. I mean, it's an ability to recognize that we are human, all too human, and yet professionally we're engaged in a different kind of exercise where there's a certain bracketing of our moral intuitions. And it's the contest of the two that produces history that is, I think, self-reflective and yet doesn't pretend to be completely outside the fray. Also, I think, you know, if you've lived as long as I have, you have a sense of things changing in your own lifetime. So you gain a certain humility by the fact that things you once believed, perspectives you once held, norms that you once took for granted, these have themselves not broken and been destroyed, but have been, I would say, refracted through subsequent history, been modified, been made more complex. So you gain a certain humility about your own point of view because you recognize instead of a point, it's on a kind of continuing, we might say, developmental process which allows you to be flexible. And it's flexibility rather than rigidity that I think is a virtue that historians at their best, any of us really at our best, display.
Continuation, if we can talk about your critique, do you believe attempts at this moral clarity in historical writing are misguided, and or can they also still serve a political or an ethnic function in the larger methodological way?
Well, there are many functions. I mean, history is often written, for example, I mean, I think the most obvious modern function is a kind of nation building function, that history is written from the point of view of the emergence of the nation state, of the validity and the almost historical inevitability of the nation state. When Weltgeschichte ist das Weltgericht, the phrase that, that Schiller and Hegel made famous, this was in the context of a Germany that was trying to unite, and a Germany that saw itself as, somehow the pinnacle of civilization, of culture, of philosophy, uh, which had a mission. Now, other countries, France, for example, England, other European countries also believed that they had certain missions, and the histories that they often wrote were written from the point of view of that. And I'm not in any way a history historian of India, but I know, of course, the history of India also has a strong, let's say, debate about the importance of the nation. My good friend Sumati Ramaswamy has written about, for example, the ideal of Mother India and all. So it's quite clear that there are ways in which almost every nation on earth has these kind of justificatory stories. I mentioned the manifest destiny of the United States against Mexico. So what we discover when we travel to other countries, when we read the histories of other countries, is that these often clash. And, we gain a kind of humility, I think, over the fact that our own national destiny, conflicts with the other national destinies of alleged, peoples elsewhere. And so there is a way in which we once again bracket this and see it as functional in the service of something which elites have benefited from. This narrative. It's not as if there is a thing called the people of the nation. It's itself an historical construct. And so we step back from the very idea of a people, a nation, a race, any of these kind of given categories. So history has, both what I would say a functional myth making capacity, but also a demythologizing capacity. That historians ask, well, what really is this nation? Does it have a destiny? Who is included? What does it mean for those who are excluded? The people who are not worthy of being part of the nation. And, I don't have to give you examples of that. So I think all of these are part of the way in which historians are involved in a kind of, very, very basic questioning of who we are understood on that level. One good example, recent example, is the so-called historische Streit in Germany, which broke out in the 1980s, the historians' debate, which pitted some people who wanted to normalize Germany and, in a way, bracket the Holocaust, bracket the Nazi period, and those who said no, Germany had this terrible, unique past, this burden that it could not avoid, that it was something about what Germany had become during the Nazi period that made German historians aware, should make them aware of the fact you couldn't write German history as if it were normal. Something pathological had occurred. And this is a debate, I don't want to go into the specifics, which really was quite, viciously fought on a national level. This was not just professional historians. It was in the newspapers, the government defended one side over the other. It was a very, very crucial debate. And I would imagine India today, there are many debates that, are about the same model of what constitutes Indian national identity.
Talking about the debates, there are debates around historical justice, whether it is the reparation of colonialism
Right,
or the toppling of monuments and
right.
statues. How do you evaluate those debates within your framework of contingent and unstable historical judgments?
Well, this is, of course, practically a real issue today. And, we've discovered that there's no one size that fits all. In other words, we have a big debate over slavery reparations. And it's quite clear, there's no debate about this, that an enormous injustice was done to people brought to the United States from Africa against their will, whose labor was exploited, whose lives were disturbed, who, I mean, I don't have to go to the horrors of slavery. So there's no question that that was an injustice. And the United States has to somehow come to grips with it, has to, what the Germans call work it through, or, realize that it's part of who we are. And so, for example, there is a big debate between using the year 1619 as the origin of American history, when slaves were first brought, versus 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. So, these are two images. One stresses slavery, the original sin, the other stress. Now, there's no simple answer to this. It's quite clear that there are current interests involved. The pushback of the Trump administration against the 1619 vision is very strong. He's now renamed the bases in favor of the Confederate generals after whom they were based, the army base. So there's a kind of pushback against what happened during the past 10 years or so. It goes back and forth. My feeling is that much of this is symbolic. It's not, we can't undo the evils of slavery. And reparations, as a kind of financial trade-off, may have been justifiable, was justifiable after the Holocaust to the Jews who survived. I mean, German reparations to surviving Jews and perhaps even to the state of Israel were justified by what had been done so recently to Jewish victims. Slavery, I don't know how many, 5 generations in the past, whatever it is, it's very hard to know to whom that money would be paid. So there are other ways perhaps to recognize, maybe I don't want to get into the weeds of the debate, but it's very difficult to know what real justice. So I mentioned tort law, in which you try to make compensation. Very difficult for historians to do that. So one of the things that I thought the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa did very successfully was to say, look, we have to know the truth about what happened. We can't repress that. Terrible things were done during the apartheid regime. But if we're going to reconcile, we have to at least move forward rather than dwell too much on the past. We have to move forward and accept a kind of, we might say, historicization of injustice where it becomes something in the past. I'm just to, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but just to talk about the Middle East today. Those people who want to have a full reparation, we might say, to the injustices done to the Palestinians, uh, are asking for something that cannot be done because Israel is a country which has 8 million Jews who came from all over the Middle East and Europe. They can't be sent back. They can't be, I mean, in other words, the 75 years since the creation of Israel, it's simply impossible to go back and redo it. The same thing with, say, the Aboriginals in Australia, American Indians. There are symbolic ways, and in Palestine, more than symbolic ways. But the absolute reparation, the absolute turning the clock back, the absolute restoration of justice, no, can't be done. So, but the recognition of injustice, but a kind of honoring the victims, a kind of, refusal to hide the original sins. Well, that I think does some good in the future.
And before ending this live stream, I wanted to also ask you these two historiographical questions that I think that came up in the conversation. First is, if there can be no last historian, how should we, as students of history and as historians, think about the responsibility of the profession in writing about the present, particularly in the moments of political crisis in the world and
Right.
even the moral crisis that we see in the world today?
Well, there is no consensus that will ever be achieved. There is no last historian who will say this is what really happened. History is not, we might say, an attempt to discover facts which, like in a court of law, will prove guilt or innocence. It doesn't work that way. I mean, history itself is a practice in the present and in the future, and of course it exists in the past, in which narratives are written, explanations are given. There are varieties of ways in which history is maybe even reenacted. There are various things in museums that are historical displays and exhibitions. History is itself a kind, we might say, discourse. And this discourse is one that is ongoing. And like any discourse, it involves, we might say, argument, it involves persuasion, it involves evidence, it involves logic, it involves willing to listen, it involves inclusion, it involves allowing new evidence to change the fixed ideas, allowing new arguments to intervene. So the great thing about history is that it is really a community of historians, and it's one that has porous boundaries, including what the Germans like to call barefoot historians, people who are not professionals, who are included in the discussion. So I would say the mission of history, such as it is to argue. Is to present different accounts, to try to present accounts that are more persuasive, without having the hubris to believe that there'll ever be a single account. And historians are part of the larger civilization, the larger context in which they are embedded. So they can't hover above. We're not, in some sense, outside of our own time. And this gives us a participatory, I would say, let's say challenge. So there are some societies where historians really play a role. In other words, Germany is a good example, where historians were listened to for, a great deal of the nation building process. Other places, they're just a kind of, let's say, academic profession. No one reads them. They're not significant. I like the context in which historians can be part of a national discussion, but without the hubris to think that we have some sort of, larger right to tell the story as if it were the right story. Historians should, like all scholars, be critical, be self-critical, be reflective, and not be hubristically above the fray.
Thank
I
you
ask a
to
question, Ishan?
yes, Professor Thakur. Yes.
Thank you for a really interesting lecture, Professor. I was actually going to suggest that if history was indeed a way in which the sense of providence and destiny found a secularized kind of mode, I think what we see, and not just in India, but I think in many parts of the world, is a return to a kind of not just a majoritarian rewriting of history, which we are seeing in India, which is, in a way where your basic commitment to facticity or even to interpretation is being trodden over by a certain mythologizing of the past in the name of a certain majoritarian religious nationalism. So the big question here is that I wanted to ask you about this distinction you've made between judgment and the delivery of justice. So when we think of the last judgment or any kind of religious redemption, we feel that whatever the sins you've committed, there will be a judgment at the end, and true justice will be delivered even to the victims, to those who've been wronged. But that sense of whether history can ever deliver justice, the historian can be judgmental about the wrongs of the past and have a commitment to unearthing them. But I'm wondering what the moral delivery of justice would indicate within a kind of secularized historical profession. Because we are often told that history has no morality. Uh, so what is the moral compass? And I think that's a question to ask, that where we are watching victims becoming the worst kinds of perpetrators of a historical injustice again, right? So in some sense, would you feel that there's anything moral about the profession of history writing? The morality is to be true to the material you find and how you judge it, independent of your own political interest. But we know that the historian is not neutral. But I'm asking a larger question between the historian's judgment, where you judge between fact and interpretation. You will not say that the Holocaust never happened, though it may well could say, just like you may actually say that no genocide happened in Palestine. But I'm asking that, is there a delivery of justice embedded in the notion of history writing, the ethics of history writing?
Excellent question. Excellent series of difficult questions. I mean, I absolutely agree, just to take the last point, that historians themselves, as a kind of tribe of writers who have a certain professional ethic, are compelled to be truthful rather than truth-telling. That is to say, if I see a document, I can't forge it. I can't deny, I can't tear it up. I have to be truthful. Now, does this mean I'm telling the truth about the past by looking at the document? No. But it means that I'm trying as best as I can to be honest about what I've seen in the sources. I'm trying to be honest about how I interpret them. And I owe to you, as another historian, my truthfulness about where I'm coming from, what sources I'm using. And, I take and listen to what you're doing in response. So that's what I would call professional morality, the ethics of our profession, that we, don't fake our news. We don't fake alternative facts. So we have a kind of, I would say, very healthy moral investment in honesty. And of course, if someone is discovered to have made up a footnote, or they're banished from the profession. I mean, basically. So I think that's one of the intraprofessional ethical standards. Now, the larger question about how being historical and understanding the past may help to secure justice in the world and judge action. I think, first of all, we have to avoid two alternatives. One, the idea that we'll ever achieve a full and total understanding of the past and a full or total judgment about it. That on the one hand. So the absolute notion of a godlike judgment, a godlike eternal understanding, that's never going to happen. The opposite extreme is the absurdist notion that history is random, no one is responsible, that we're basically unable to judge anything, that stuff happens, and that history is therefore a tale told by an idiot, sound and fury signifying nothing. So there's that version of it. And I think we're obviously somewhere in between. The stories we tell, the micro stories, let's say, discrete narratives we tell, often have within them, embedded in them, tragic, comic, ironic, satiric, to use Hayden White's description. These are important. And they convey with them a certain charge, a moral charge, that the victims in a tragedy are understood to be basically worthy of being mourned, worthy of being seen as, somehow innocent victims in many cases. That's what tragedy is all about. They don't cause their own. Now, the crucial function that I think historians play in serving justice today is the denaturalization function. In other words, what you have to show by history is that the conditions that exist today are not natural, inevitable, are not part of some sort of order that is ordained, but rather came into being. And they came into being through power, through passing to one group and the exploitation of resources by another group. In other words, it gives us in the present a recognition that people are if you want to call it victim, or maybe the benefit of circumstances that they themselves didn't create. That no one is self-made. That everybody is in some sense the product of what came before. And historians denaturalize the present in such a way that we're able then to recognize that maybe something can be done to change the future. And I think that's in a way what history, when you deny history, when you create myth and shut off the past, you're also shutting off the future. You're saying the future is also not contingent. So history is a record, we might say, of contingencies that had effects. And those effects will continue into the future, bad as well as good, unless we recognize them as contingent, as not necessary, as not inevitable, as not fated, as not natural. I think that's the function that we play. And when someone tries to deny that, to cut off, there's nothing worse than cutting off the past through a kind of official history. I mean, what we're seeing in the United States now is incredibly dangerous. Trump is really trying to create an official version of the past in school books, in museums, in universities. He's really trying to do it in a way that has never been done, at least in my lifetime in the United States, and which many of us feel is on the road towards some sort of Orwellian future. Now, this may be too dramatic, but
So that's what's happening in the country we live in.
Well,
There's
this
a
is what
radical rewriting, which actually no professional historian can prove. So this
no,
is an interesting notion that there's
no,
public history, there's
no.
official history. So you're having textbooks from which COVID is being written off, and our prime minister is being shown as the great person who slayed the demon of COVID. The Muslims are being written out of history. So I'm thinking, if history is the weapon of the powerful, history was also the weapon of the weak, right? So today, if the Palestinians can claim ground on the basis of history, the Muslims can claim legitimacy in this territorial region on the basis of history, right? So we can see how history can become the weapon both ways. But I'm still thinking that why is it that the truth and reconciliation model has really not worked in most cases where there's been long histories of historical injustice, of
No.
oppression? It's not really worked, and it's not even a model that can be taken forward, because it seems that the idea of reparation and reconciliation is not open. I mean, there were notions like historical apologies. Now, what would it mean for Britain to apologize to India so many years later for colonizing? It would mean nothing. It's nothing more than a small moral or pyrrhic victory. But now it seems it's gone completely the other way. Far from undoing historical injustice, you wish to erase, this idea of people without history. I think what Eric Wolff wrote a long time ago, I think today has come true in the sense you wish to erase that altogether. So I think what you pointed out is very, very important, that is happening perhaps all through the world, that there is the profession of the historian, which is continuing to thrive, but there's also the spilling of public history. And maybe Ishan can come in here, that theirs are a young organization fighting for a new kind of space for public history. A new kind of alternative public history, which is non-official, non-majoritarian. But it's often the beast of public history, what people like to believe. So Christian America and a Hindu India would like to believe in a certain kind of, and the recent war has shown the worst kinds of patriotic rewriting of history, which is almost terrifying. So I think as a historian myself, I feel that our profession is important, but increasingly now being edged out by a different kind of nationalism. In 19th century, nations needed history. I think now 21st century, is undoing that discipline for a different kind of political end, or maybe that's kind of a thing. But anyway, I think you really got us thinking very, very kind of profoundly on what the moral compass of a history is at all.
I must say it's alarming, that both our countries are, these are two of the great countries of the world are now engaged in this similar struggle to avoid, a kind of imposition of a mythic history which will marginalize the work done by serious historians to make the past complex, to make the past, we can't undo, but we can tell, we can narrate, we can remember, we can avoid to allow things that were forgotten to be completely and totally lost. It's not everything, and we can't undo it. The history of humankind is the history, alas, of injustice after injustice after injustice, depending on how we define justice. But it's not a pretty story, and we're confused about it. The violence that exists in the world, that is a world that should not be violent, we can't explain it. We can't undo it, and we can't really explain it. And it seems to be every time you go one step back, one step forward, you go two steps back. So it's the end of my life, and I just had a email from Jürgen Habermas, who's a good friend. He's 95. His whole life, he's been engaged in public struggles, in trying to make a Germany that would be a better Germany from the one he was born into. And he writes, and his last email, I have never been more pessimistic, about what's happening in Germany and the United States. I've never been more pessimistic. What is one to say that he's wrong? So, but there's still hope in the writing. The thing that's important is that the pessimism is justified.
Continue to do the work we do. I think the live streaming will be over, but thank you very much for really making us think critically about the work that they're doing.
Thank you so much, Professor J, and even Professor Tapati Goa Thakurta, for your comments, which were very important for our time. And as a member of the Generation Z, the new age, so too, we are yet to come. We are waiting in line, but I think we have a longer struggle to see, and a longer fight to a longer battle to fight. But at least, as our Indian journalist Ravish says, not all battles are fought to be won. Some are fought only to tell the
Because
world
they
that
have
we
to
were
be
there.
fought. Exactly.
And I hope that there should be more young collectives, not just in India, but now around the world, which take this fight forward. And what you mentioned about Fidel Castro, I was remembering what our former Prime Minister of India said, Dr. Manmohan Singh, that history will judge me kindly. And we talked about those judgments today, where you argued that neither the two modes, which is the written accounts and the true events, provide true moral judgments or absolution, as what Fidel had thought of. I think with that thought, thank you so much. We'll end the live stream now, and there will be some bonus clips on YouTube and on Instagram, which we'll record with Professor J, and you can watch it maybe day after tomorrow after some edits. But till then, take care. As I always say before we end the lecture on Caravan, keep reading, keep thinking, keep questioning. That's how you'll keep yourself sane in these insane times.